Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the soft, hard launch of the new partnership between Black Sox and Transform. We're going to get into some of what that's about throughout the next hour and a half. My name is Viv Amun. I am one of the co-directors of and founders of Black Sox, which is a social action and asset-based community development network. And again, throughout the next hour and a half, we will get into some of the detail about Black Sox because in the 4 or 5 years that it's been in existence, it's made a point of not actively promoting itself as a brand, which is contrary to what we see with many Black-led organizations in the UK and elsewhere. I've got a co-host with me today, the delectable Katrina. I'm going to let her introduce herself because I know she's going to do a much better job of it than myself, and I think if she's been too modest, I might add some bits on the end. So, Katrina.
Thank you, Viv. Katrina French. I'm the founding director of Unjust CIC. It's a social enterprise that operates within the criminal justice field. I'm a former CEO of Stopwatch and have a specialism and an interest in stop and search policing, community engagement, and overall, I suppose, police accountability. So it's such an honour and a pleasure to be co-hosting this evening.
Great. So I'm a pleasure to have, I'm very excited, and it's a real pleasure for me to have you co-hosting with me. I've already had some comments on the way that I've dressed this evening. I think it's appropriate. We have a Beauty and the Beast scenario playing out here. I'm a little bit urban-y, and maybe I'll talk about what's going on in the background in terms of events and initiatives that we've got coming up. But for this evening, it's all about the drugs legislation, the commodification of deregulation of cannabis and all of the social dimensions surrounding that and how it relates to the African Caribbean heritage community in the UK. So that's probably all I'm going to say about it over the next hour and a half, because we've got a whole range of experts coming on to unpack every element of it. As a starter, this hour and a half is really the beginning of a 2-year campaign for our partnership. The first guest that we've got on this evening is Jane Slater, who forms the other half of our partnership with Transform. So she's going to come on and say a little bit about the policy context, a little bit about Transform, and then we can move on from there. So let's get Jane Slater on now and get this evening's events and discussions underway. Jane.
Thank you very much, Viv. Thank you, Katrina. I'm really delighted to be speaking tonight and excited to be launching this new partnership between Transform and Black Sox. It's been a long time coming to fruition, this partnership, but it really feels like a timely and relevant moment to be launching it here tonight. And we're really, really grateful for the Trust for London for initiating some funding for our programme of work going forward. Transform is a charity.
Thank you for that. The point that you're making about Trust for London seed funding in this initiative is a really important point, and I apologise for not making that earlier.
Transform is a charity and think tank. We've been working in the area of drugs for over 25 years. Our work broadly divides into 2 areas: a critique of the status quo and our vision of an alternative system. We've written groundbreaking publications that have been used to advise governments as countries have reformed their drug laws. I also run a campaign called Anyone's Child, which is all about telling the very real human stories of how lives are being destroyed by our current drug laws. Many of these families have lost children to drugs, and all these families have come together to call for the legal control and regulation of the drug market. This year it's a historic year. It marks the 50th anniversary of our Misuse of Drugs Act. That is the legislation that puts in place the current drug policy we have in the UK here today. That is a policy that has been racist, and it has driven oppressive and disproportionate policing in our communities. No matter which indicator you look at, it has been a huge and epic failure, and we're doing a major campaign of work around it this year. Loads of activities going on, and it's a really, really great time to engage with this issue. I've really been very privileged in my time working at Transform to have or before COVID happened, to be able to travel a lot. And I've done several visits to the US. What has always struck me is the different tone of the debate over there, in contrast to here in the UK. In particular, the volume of the discussions around the racial injustice of drug enforcement and the need for reform and the fight for social equity. Despite the statistics, and the volume of that debate has been so much louder over there than it has in the UK, despite the statistics being just as ugly over here. And this is one of the real issues.
I know you're full head of steam, but can I pause you there for a second, just to tease out some of the points as they're coming up? Why do you think there's been that disparity in terms of volume and focus?
Well, I think there's been some really brilliant work done in the UK. My colleague Neve, who's going to be speaking soon, but there hasn't been that same community level of activism that you can see, and it really feels palpably different. Often in the UK, you find it's white people talking on behalf of the Black community around this racial injustice, as I am now, rather than it really coming from the community. And I think that is a real omission in the debate. And as I was going to say, drug policy reform is happening. This isn't a sort of theoretical discussion. We're going to hear a whole load tonight about the US, but it's also Canada, Mexico, Uruguay, soon to be Switzerland, Luxembourg, Israel. This is a real growing trend we've got. And it seems almost inevitable that this issue will be a serious proposition here in the UK soon. And there are some really important lessons coming out of the different reforms that are occurring around the world. One of these real key issues is that you need to put social equity into policy at the outset. Canada didn't do this. And what we see is the corporates largely controlling the market. And it's really difficult to put these kinds of things in retrospectively. In contrast, in the US, there's been some really interesting developments. Some real experts here tonight who will talk all about that. But I think we need to be looking at these lessons and learning from them. We've got an opportunity to write our policies going forward. And we hope that through this programme of work, some of those most impacted by our current policy will be at the policy making table as future policy is developed. And that's our intention. It really feels like the right time to be building this important programme of work. And we're going to be building it over the next 2 years. So I encourage you to check us out, follow us and get involved. Thank you.
Lovely. You've already touched on some really powerful points there. Well, let me just pick up on the allyship bit, because I think, you know, that's the really important part of our partnership for me. The fact that you have essentially got a very traditional, well-respected, mainstream, white-led organization allying with a Black organization, Black-led, ACH, African Caribbean Heritage community-led organization, and recognizing the need to do all of the things that you've talked about, as well as, you know, working out some of the real challenges and difficulties with partnerships and allyships like this. We've got a 2-year relationship that we're committed to in the first instance, and we're definitely as committed to teasing out all of the important learning that we want to disseminate widely around how organizations like ourselves can work together to bring about the change that we say we want to see. So again, I'm involved in so many different things, but I can genuinely say that this is the most exciting and inspirational initiative that I'm involved in at the moment. I think it's also important to state that this partnership hasn't come about as a consequence of a pot of money becoming available. We've been working towards this for a good, solid 3 years, and the partnership is built on relationships. In most of our meetings, we're laughing all the time and cracking jokes, and it's important for that level of solidarity to be in place to give us the resilience for the challenges and the hard times that will come. So I'm probably going to keep coming back to that, because I think you've already hit on one of the major points, which is that, you know, as Lee and I committed to in 2016 now, you know, we're determined to put the Black voice at the forefront of this agenda going forwards, and we've taken our time to create the strategic capacity to be able to make that happen. And we know the partnership with Transform is exactly the right way to go forwards. So that's my party political piece, with party with a small p. I think we should get into maybe some more of this evening's discussions. So let's have the next guest on. Cassandra Frederique, Executive Director, Drugs Policy Alliance, the movement in the US. And what we're going to want to hear from Cassandra is back to the mentoring and the coaching from yourselves, our big brothers and big sisters across the water, so that we can, spend as little time making mistakes as possible as we move this forward. So Cassandra, glad to have you here. I know you're a very, very busy sister, so we're very grateful for your time. I'll let you open.
Thank you. So I super appreciate this opportunity to speak to you all this evening. I'm from the organization Drug Policy Alliance, which is a national organization in the US working to end the criminalization associated with drugs. We've been a part of a lot of the cannabis legalization, regulation initiatives throughout the country, and we have learned a lot of we are so excited to be here in conversation with you, because we think that cannabis regulation in general really pushes up to a thing that we've been talking about in the drug policy space, which really is about the market, and how I think it also shows the limits of social change under a capitalist structure. The same reasons why people are unable to get funding for housing or for businesses don't disappear when we get into cannabis regulation. And so I think as Black people, this is an opportunity for us to not just try to create space for ourselves in cannabis, but really to call out the underlying conditions that make it very difficult for us to aspire and build wealth in any industry. We've had a really, really, really hard time in beating back capitalism in the US. And I think we are actively pushing and trying to navigate what is social equity, right? I think one of the things that a lot of advocates of color in the US are having the conversation about is like, yes, obviously we want social equity, but that feels like sometimes it limits us, and that we should be demanding for way more. And I think part of it is that the industry will want to segment us into a small group and say, this is what they'll give you. And so somehow we're still fighting for crumbs when we should be having the loaf of bread. And we're seeing a blackwashing. And what I mean is very much with the violence associated with law enforcement throughout the, in the global war against Black people, we're seeing these corporations use the language of movement as a way to really pad their business development. And that happens so much in cannabis. So much. But none of it actually is impacted or changes their bottom line and what they're willing to do to cut our communities out, to destabilize markets and make it really hard for us to generate our own wealth. And so some of the things that I think are important, and I'm really excited that my fellow countrymen, Shailene and Amber, are on here, is because there are limits to the thing that we thought we'd want. So oftentimes they're giving us the things that we say, and they are not workable. And part of it is because we underestimated the market, and not just the cannabis market, but the larger corporate market. And I don't always think we have the right plan on how to actually disrupt the market in a way. And so we're playing catch up. And so I think in the UK, part of the conversation in your strategy right now is how do we actively disrupt the larger corporate market, not just the cannabis market? Because regardless, if what we do in cannabis, if it's less likely to reverberate in all the different ways, because you need more than cannabis to actually get a stake. And so I think it's just a broader fight, where we thought it was more siloed, but it's actually a bigger fight. And it's a fight that we've been in for a long time. And this is a new tool in order for us to get further in that fight.
That was fantastic to hear about what's happening over there in the States, Cassandra. I wondered, we were speaking about allyship with Jane. How has that panned out in terms of the journey for Black activists, African-American activists in that space in the States in terms of allyship?
I think what's really hard about cannabis is that allyship can be tested based on what people are trying to get to. So there are people who are in the space that their goal is to make the most money that they can. And then there are people in the space that are trying to disrupt the market, right? And create new streams of income, new kinds of economies. But the thing that is also difficult is that there's a lot of tokenization of Black folks in this space. You also see this very much in our celebrity class, who have cannabis companies that are backed by white money. They could have made different choices to build like a Black social class around cannabis, but because we are ruled by the almighty dollar in the U.S., they are making decisions and giving people leeway by using their so-called clout in our community. And so I think in the space of cannabis, allyship is possible, but it takes a deeper level of commitment and relationship building and understanding where people want to get off in the relationship.
And a kind of follow-up question as you were speaking about that was about the kind of understanding from impacted communities in terms of equity. And would you say they're informed, and I don't want to use the word educated, but have they had access to the necessary information to feel empowered to be part of the conversation the way you are, let's say? Or do you feel there's kind of a wider educational program that needs to go on to build the social capital needed for them to be present and participate in that space?
I think what's so important is that impacted communities always knew that this would happen, right? So it was the policy people, it was the Black people in policy that were like, we're gonna legalize weed and it's gonna be amazing, right? And it's like the local this entrepreneur in my neighborhood who's like, can you not do this actually, because this is gonna mess everything up? And I'm like, no, it's gonna be better. And so the educated, we really screwed the pooch on this, right? Like we really, I think if more of the folks that are in the NGOs actually built these policies with folks that were in the pre-existing market, then we got the okie doke and they're paying for it. And so now we're trying to catch up. And it goes to show just, it is definitely a lesson to learn about broader drug policy in general. And it's also the lesson we always end up with, which is really frustrating. But I think that there are certain things that folks need more information on, which is like how to get capital, how to operate in a business in the structure that exists. But again, I don't think those things are, I think some of those things are cannabis distinct, but I think those are the same things around Black business ownership in general, right? Like cannabis is a microcosm of that. And so there's just a broader need for our community to have access to capital, to have access to technical support and capacity building and financing in order to build businesses, right? So much of this moment is support Black business, and these things don't exist, right? And so cannabis really highlights that because there's a new industry and folks feel like we can actually do something different in this moment. But the hard thing is that it's the same inputs for why it never worked out in other ways. And I'm not trying to be depressing or like there's no way out. I'm just saying like, this is not about cannabis. This is about how do we build Black wealth, African and Caribbean descendant wealth. It's like regulation is not going to legalize Black people. It's also not going to create this fountain. Like some of us will make money, but the kind of broad-based like economic engineering, we have to have a different conversation. In the US, we're behind. But y'all have the opportunity to really think about market disruption as a strategy for communities to move that forward.
I think coming in there with my kind of policy background and seeing how conservative the UK is with us, well, it's got a conservative government, so it's conservative with a big C and a small c, is how we galvanize the support for that conversation. Because when I speak to many people, they actually are, I say, anti-drugs. I feel there's an education around and a stigma around admitting you use cannabis or that your family uses cannabis. So even before we get to making money out of cannabis, people are like, I don't, how do we educate them? How do we change that mind thinking in terms of the policy's been wrong and we need to fix the policy and also look at redistribution of wealth? And I think it'd be really interesting, and I hope we hear this through the rest of the evening, is how those conversations have played out in bringing communities along and making sure that they're the heart of the policy change and also able to access any entrepreneurial benefits from the changes that will come. So yeah, really looking forward to hearing more this evening around those kind of bringing people together issues.
Yeah, and my parents are from the island of Haiti, and so I come from a conservative Caribbean background, and my parents are probably still upset that I work on cannabis reform, right? Even though it's like literally my bread and butter now. But I think part of the thing that has moved them, even if they're not supportive ultimately, is the justice impacts. I think the justice impacts have been truly transformational. And then also this idea that white people are getting away with something. So my family has reacted to this thing like, so you incarcerate us and then you make money off of it and then we can't get into it. That sense of fairness is one where my parents are like, I don't want the weed thing, but it's not fair that they can incarcerate us and then make money on it at the same time. And I think that kind of education where it's like showing how much of it is pre-based in institutional racism moved a lot of people. So we have faith leaders of color, Black faith leaders in the US who have now moved to support regulation, not because they care about cannabis, but because they realize that the stigma that is impeding them from being in the conversation is only bolstering the impacts of harm and violence by the state. And so I would say that a lot of the Black folks you'll hear in the US will be like, well, I don't smoke drugs. Like that stigma is still there. It's lessening, right? But I think focusing on the justice and the disruption has been helpful in us actually bringing in more conservative Black folks. But it's not easy. But I think that when I focus on justice and focus on like, look at these white people, they're making all this money and these people are incarcerated, I think folks start like being like, I don't really like this, but I'm not okay with us not being a part of it. Yeah.
Great. Listen, I've just been watching the quotes coming up on the screen, so you're really striking the right note for the audience. A lot of the key points that you've made have resonated, and the same with Katrina as well. Look, I've met you for the first time this evening. I'm expecting us to become real close buddies going forward, friends, and this is part of the process of the alliance, I guess. That we can't any of us do it on our own. It doesn't matter what country we're in and what race we are. If we believe that there's an injustice there, we will have to come together to make that happen. So I know you've got to rush off, so I've got one question for you. A bit of coaching before you go. So given that we're just getting out the gate with our alliance, what's the one piece of advice you'd leave us with in terms of getting it right going forwards?
I think that in the US, cannabis reform has been going on for a really long time. And our work really galvanized once we were unapologetic about race. We were super unapologetic. There was a moment like 10, 12 years ago where we were like, actually, this is not about the plan at all. This is about how you have used this as a tool of racial and social control to kill us, to harm us, to break up our communities. And that focus, that unapologetic focus, has gotten us to a place where not only have we been able to get more justice reforms out of cannabis, we have been able to try to disrupt the markets, but also that we have gotten people to a place where they talked about that the government made an intentional choice to use these laws to harm our communities. Therefore, if we are moving away from that choice, we need to make the intentional choice to repair those communities, to reinvest in those communities. And so it took us some years to get there. And I would say that the impacted community in 2015 showed up to a conference in 2015 in the US, and they wore "What About Pookie" t-shirts. And these were formerly incarcerated people. And they, at every session, they were like, "What about Pookie?" Because we were talking about cannabis a lot. And they were like, "What about it? What about it? What about it?" And that's when the conversation had already started moving. I think you should start there. Don't wait. And honestly, Black folks need to lead in the UK. White people should be supporting the Black agenda around drug policy. It's not the other way around. Do not let white organizations say like, "Oh, we want to do this thing," and now come in and like give us the racial justice analysis. The racial justice analysis has to be first. Drugs is one pillar in that, because it's not just drugs that are impacting our global Black community. There's multiple things. The world hates Black people. And so, especially in these white countries. And so we have to be clear that drugs is one strategy towards our liberation. It's not the end all be all, as some of these organizations try to make. And so the coaching that I would offer is to the Black advocates in the UK: lead. Unapologetically lead.
Oh, wow.
You heard it.
I can't get a sentence out. Thank you, Cassandra. Thank you so much. I just got a question in from Paul asking if it's just cannabis or should all drugs be decriminalized and legalized. And I think that's a question we can maybe, I know you're going to introduce Neve, so maybe we'll get Neve to pick up on that specifically. But thank you so much, Cassandra. You may hang around a little bit. I know you've got to shoot off. So thank you in anticipation of your immediate departure, and looking forward to see you again. Most definitely in the flesh at some point. You know, I know Katrina and Jane and James have already got their
do not hesitate. This is definitely a global war against Black folks. And so we need global strategies to actually build our liberation and freedom. So have a good rest of your conversation. Thanks so much for having me.
Have a nice day. Thank you. Okay, so we've got a jam-packed team. I'm going to move on to Neve Eastwood. I've had the pleasure of working with Neve for several years now. She's the director of Release. Release is a national drugs charity. Neve, are you there? Are you ready to come and share with us your expertise? It would be really fantastic to hear from you, kind of the state of play in the UK when it comes to cannabis law, maybe touch on some of what Sadiq is planning to do. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Katrina. And it is an honor to be on this panel with all of you amazing folks. And just really delighted about this project, this partnership between Transform and Black Socks. I think it's going to be really exciting work and really important work. I'm afraid I'm one of those white women who's going to talk about racial justice stats. I apologize for that, but the work that we've done at Release really has been inspired by the work of Drug Policy Alliance. And Viv, you talked about, you know, the conversation in the US being so much further ahead than the UK. And I think part of that was kind of the missing piece of really, like, we at Release, we provide legal services to folks. And our offices were, at this time when we did this work, were based in East London, and we'd have the kids coming up from Hackney who were just telling us they were being stopped and searched repeatedly for cannabis, you know, 3-4 times a week, like harassed. And so, you know, like with everything, it's not enough just to tell the story, you have to evidence the story. And so we worked with Stopwatch and others, and Katrina was part of that work in 2018 to really highlight the racial disparities and how the drug laws were driving racial disparities within the criminal justice system. And I think it's really important that we say that drug law reform will not in any way dismantle systemic racism, but it does remove one of those tools of oppression. And that's why it's important that we have this conversation. And so the work that we did at Release, we started this about 7 years ago, but the most recent report was published in 2018, The Colour of Injustice. Katrina and I worked tirelessly on it. Katrina did all the amazing outreach with media. That was her who did that. But the stats were pretty horrifying. So Black people 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs, despite using drugs at a lower rate than the white population. And that's important because when you hear conversations about stop and search, it's often sort of premised around knife crime. And in fact, 60% of our stop and searches are around drugs, and it's mainly possession of drugs, and it's mainly possession of cannabis. So this is really damaging the experience of young Black men in particular in their communities. They are being harassed, they are being stopped and searched and controlled by the police. It's a form of violence, and I think we have to keep reiterating that it is a form of violence. And then when people are caught in possession of drugs, white people are much more likely to get out-of-court disposals. They're not prosecuted. They often don't end up with criminal records. But for young Black men who actually are less likely to be found in possession of drugs by the police, but are much more likely to get the harsher sanctions. So they are more likely to be prosecuted. So the stats show that Black people are 11 times more likely to be prosecuted for cannabis possession than the white than their white counterparts. And I think part of those stats, and then, stats are often boring, but part of that is that educational piece that Katrina and Cassandra were talking about bringing communities along, about having communities understand that justice impact that Cassandra mentioned. So that's some of the damage. So it really is Black and brown folks in the UK who are feeling who are at the forefront of the war on drugs. It is not just, as Jane said, a US experience. It is endemic around the world that these laws are used to control populations. And so what are the solutions? And as I said, drug law reform, cannabis reform will not dismantle systemic racism. But if we are going to recognize the harm it does to Black and brown communities, then we need to make sure that our solutions are at least founded in principles of social justice. And so one of the pieces of work we're doing at the moment is drafting a paper which talks about some of those experiences in the US that Cassandra mentioned, and I think Shalene will be talking about those, but really trying to promote a model of cannabis legalization that seeks to expunge criminal records, because why should someone who has been criminalized in a market that was deemed illicit but now is licit is continued to be treated as criminal, and all of what is the damage that causes them in terms of participating not only in legal cannabis markets, but legal markets more generally. We need to make sure that decriminalization is also part of this model. It's not enough just to legalize weed. For example, in Canada, they continue to criminalize people who are caught in possession of illicit cannabis. So that's a prohibition 2.0, where it's the same people who were criminalized before who will be criminalized again. And we need to look at opportunities for participation. This, whether you like it or not, this is a market that does benefit some of the most deprived communities in our country. And what I would like to see is, with all of the caveats that Cassandra said, is how do we help people transition from those illicit markets into licit markets? Because those folks know how to run those markets. And as part of that paper, that work, what we want to do is try and create a coalition of people who will say, this is our red line for cannabis reform in the UK. This is what we all want to see. And that's drug policy organizations, civil liberty organization, racial justice organization, all of the folks, because we're up against big business. And big business is going to be really active in this space. It's going to have resources that we don't. So I think it's really important that we speak with one voice that really speaks to a regulated market that focuses on racial justice principles and social justice principles. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the stats. People commenting that they're not at all boring. I think that what they do is bring to life the lived experiences that many in my time as a stopwatch, in my time as a chair of a scrutiny panel hearing about repeated stops, it brings to life that this is a real issue, and the numbers, they don't lie. So really, thank you for sharing that. Can I just look back to like the last year, and in terms of the pandemic and the sort of policing you saw then, and some of the reasons that the police were out and about at a kind of time of a global pandemic, what was the kind of rationale being used last year?
Yeah, I mean, you and I talked about this quite a bit. We were really horrified. I think we both thought, Katrina, that, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, we would see stop and search reduce because, you know, everybody had to stay indoors. Physical contact is a way of transmitting the virus. So, you know, you would expect policing to fall. We saw exactly the opposite, and we were quite horrified by it. So in March 2020, the stats for, and it's only the Met Police that we have the stats for, but the Met Police reported 24,000 roughly searches that month. And that had been about the level we had seen each month for the previous 12 months, driven by drugs as usual. By May, that had gone up to 40,000 and we were in full lockdown. The rates for Black people being searched doubled. It was pretty horrific. On our helpline, we were receiving calls from people who had been strip searched. So young Black women who were seen, presumed to be carrying drugs, being taken to police stations and strip search being carried out, the use of handcuffs being used as a matter of routine. You mean all of the things in a global pandemic that you would not do. You mean there was no public health considerations. You know, it's the Met Police, so we don't expect anything less than a racist attitude from them. But you know, where is your public duty in this pandemic? So it was really distressing to hear those stories, and I can't even imagine what it was like for folks on the ground experiencing it. But I think, you know, that happened and it collided with, you know, George Floyd's murder and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement here in the UK and in countries across the world. And suddenly politicians had to do something. So you saw the mayor engaging with roundtables. And I know, Katrina, you were at that, and colleagues at Release were also part of that. And it was a pretty honest and brave conversation on a lot of activists who were just speaking truth to power. And I think some of that really has helped to focus the mayor's mind on the potential of taking different approaches. But I also think it's focused drug policy folks' mind on what we should do. I mean, our organization, we're talking a lot about, you know, abolitionist frameworks, thinking about how we advocate for reforms that pull police out of communities, because I think that's really important. So yeah, I think that the last year has been really traumatizing on the kind of dual crises of racism and the pandemic.
No, thanks. The reason I mentioned it was because we were in the midst of a pandemic and we saw how drug laws were being abused and misused and used as a means of social control, and really disappointing. So I think it's really pertinent to be having conversations about reform so that, God forbid, we get into that situation again. We don't have to be stopped and searched for the smell of cannabis when we've got COVID or Corona Part 5 coming around. But I think it was just fantastic for you to touch on that.
There are a lot of people on the call talking about, you know, decriminalization, legalization of all drugs. So maybe you can say a little bit about that. I mean, for me, someone who was in the industry many moons ago, it's a conversation that's been going on since, seems like, the dawn of time.
Yeah, no, totally. Feels like 20 years in this job, it feels like that. So yeah, I mean, I think
just before you answer that bit as well, I've been watching the documentary about corruption in the police, particularly, well, actually, I think it's exclusively Met, and it was really liberating to see Release pop up, the founder of Release. And maybe we should touch on a little bit about that, because Release is an institution. I used to run a community drugs team in Newham. And Release is one of the key organizations that we worked with very closely when, you know, we had to protect the files of our clients and all kinds of crazy stuff. So, I mean, it's important to remember that there is a historical context for all of this in the UK as well, that many in the Black community won't really appreciate from the standpoint of what we've been talking about in relation to policy and what I call the bastardized mindset of some of the institutions, particularly the police.
Yeah, no, completely. So we were set up in 1967, and it was set up by a couple of art students who were part of the countercultural movement. So very much kind of hippies. You know, and they were out protesting against the war in Vietnam and protesting for more freedoms and for equality. And it was set up in West London. So at the same time that they were protesting for these equalities around gender and around race, you had this influx of people coming from Caribbean migration, and both groups were experiencing cannabis policing. Both were being targeted by the police, being stopped and searched, being sent to prison for quite prolonged periods. The police were planting drugs on people, and particularly civil rights leaders in the Black community, as a way of disrupting that movement, but also to diminish the reputation of those folks as well. So you mean it's how these drug laws are used, and it very much reflects the kind of US experience where Nixon explicitly said, I cannot criminalize the anti-war movement or the civil rights movement. I'll use drugs to do that. And we saw exactly the same thing happen in the UK. So yes, I think it's really important we tell that history. Some of that history has been picked up in Small Axe and in other documentaries around the Mango 9. And I think that history, it's so important that we realize that often that drug policy isn't about drugs. It is about tools that are used by the state to control our lives, and in particular to control the lives of Black and brown people and those living in deprived areas. It is not surprising that our research, Katrina, when we did that report, showed that the intensity of stop and search happens in the poorest communities. Those are the people who are being surveilled all the time through the drug laws. And at the same time, then you see the highest rates of racial disparity in the affluent communities. So it's like, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. You haven't got the social or economic capital to be here. You're up to no good. So you mean it's really, it's sort of persuasive or pervasive how it undermines our rights. In terms of decriminalization and legalization, we must decriminalize and legalize all drugs. We have to get there eventually, but decriminalization has to be, so the definition of decriminalization is ending criminal sanctions for possession offenses. It is not to regulate the supply or the manufacturing of drugs. But that has to be centered within that policy, exactly because of what I described in Canada. And so people often say that these are two opposing policies. They're not. They're policies that support each other in the aims that we want to achieve, which is, equality, which is reducing the control of the state over people's choices, over people's bodies.
Perfectly articulated. So we've got at least one documentary that we've got to produce.
Let's do that.
Along with Release and all the other organisations out there.
And Unjust.
And I was
right
getting there.
Wrong,
and Unjust.
I was getting there.
It's in the tagline, Unjust, right and wrong, creating equity.
Absolutely.
I think drug law plays nicely into that. So if you guys are there, I'm definitely there too.
There were a few people asking about collaboration outside of London and so on. Theo, can you put the Black Sox email address up on the screen, please? And again, I want to reiterate the fact that today's what we're doing is just setting out the stall for this alliance, and the two organizations are effectively the catalyst for a much bigger relationship, a more formalized relationship that's focused on amplifying the Black voice around this particular issue. And we're still in the very early stages. We haven't established the uniform platforms yet that will allow people to connect up with us. So just for the purposes of this evening, people can use the Black Sox address, info@blacksox.com, to get your details through to the Alliance, and we'll definitely be engaging with you going forward to make sure that you're on the list for the newsletter that will go out, keeping you informed of what we're planning over the next year, 2 years and beyond.
Great. Well, thank you for that input, Nick. We've got now, following on from all our fantastic guests so far, once again, popping right back over to the States, we have Shalene Title. She is a drug policy activist and former member of the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Board. I had the pleasure of meeting her, was it a couple of years ago now, when we were in Hackney? Yeah. So
we've lost a year with the pandemic.
Yeah.
So you're right, it's 2 years ago.
It's about 2 years ago. So just fantastic to have her on board with the knowledge and expertise. I'm pretty sure we're all going to learn something. So, Shalene, are you around?
There she is.
Hi, can you hear me?
We
Yeah.
can.
Great to see you both.
Great to see you too. How have you been keeping well?
As well as can be. Same for you, I'm sure.
Well, as you can see, we're having a riveting discussion this evening about cannabis, drugs, entrepreneurship, social justice, and I think this sounds like your area. So we'd really welcome for you to kind of share some of your experiences on what's been going on across the pond and some of the lessons that we can learn over here in the UK.
Absolutely. I'm really excited to see this partnership. Let me explain first. So I just completed a 3-year term as inaugural commissioner of the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission. So we handled all of the aspects of state regulation, inventory tracking, security, and then my emphasis was on social justice, making sure that people from harmed communities, Black, Latinx people in particular, were able to get into the industry through ownership and through training for jobs, and then making sure we're reinvesting tax revenue into those communities, and making sure that there are, very importantly, strict limits on how big a company can get, and making sure that they can't dominate the industry early before we're able to figure out that very complex issue. And then I've been trying to work with other states, namely New York, most recently, to make sure that they do even more and hopefully see even more better results than we saw in Massachusetts, which was the first state to do it. And I think it's great that we're collaborating, and hopefully right now, where New York is kind of now, I hope for the future, the bare minimum, you will also see those types of policies as the bare minimum. But what I'm really excited about with your partnership is that, over here, there's a lot of profit and financial incentive for prohibition, but there's also a lot of, especially now, profit for commercializing cannabis and kind of co-opting the legalization movement's talking points. But there's not a lot of people who are really standing for true, sensible legalization. And when I look for that, I look to Transform. That's where I have been getting my information, during my term. And then where we do have think tanks like that here, they don't partner with the actual communities that are doing the work on the ground. And so I think you are way ahead of the curve doing this before legalization even starts. I hope people like Viv and Katrina and people in Black Sox are thinking about regulator positions like mine, where you're not advising, you're making the decisions yourself, because you should be building this. And I really love the idea that you're starting now to think about what the policies and regulations should look like, perhaps even drafting model regulations and ordinances, because if they're available and they're kind of seen as sensible now, before you get into the situation where a law is passed and then you're trying to frantically pass regulations, if you already have had this discussion, I think that'll be really helpful. And if you can talk about the challenges that we've seen in the States, all of the things that Cassandra talked about earlier. So congratulations, and I'm really happy to answer, any questions or share any insight that I can.
Thanks. Well, I don't know if you've seen, but Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, and he's spoken about now having, if he's re-elected, a commission, I suppose, to look at cannabis. What would you say to us in terms of how we inject into that argument and how we can bring people on board? It was, who was speaking to before? I think it was Cassandra, when I was explaining about the kind of conservative nature. Although in London, they're behind it and the people are polling and saying, great. How do we bring across some of those people that aren't? And how do we ensure that we get the expunging of people's records and ensure that we have the kind of the CPS here, the Crown Prosecution Service, and lawyers behind us in terms of that advocacy battle, because I think it's going to take a whole collective effort. So it'd be really good to have maybe some of the success stories, also some of the barriers to forging some of those alliances.
Well, I completely agree with what Cassandra said when she said being unapologetic was what changed everything. Because I would say when you're being unapologetic, it can rub people the wrong way. And I understand that, you know, in a conservative society and government, that can be disorienting to people. But that was actually the only tool that we had against corporations that had every other tool and resource. And they had armies of lobbyists. They even had people who would kind of be a front for some of the things that they were trying to push, right? Which would get confusing for people. And they had the ability to even, you know, put evidence that, you know, much like tobacco companies have done in the past, put evidence forward that confuses the issue. And so when you get ahead of that by organizing ahead of time and you're completely unapologetic, I think you can take advantage of organizing in a way that those companies can't. And sometimes you have to call them out for what they're doing. So I'll give you a quick example. Recently in Massachusetts, we decided to have delivery licenses. So a license to take cannabis from a warehouse and so purchase it from a manufacturer, keep it in a warehouse and deliver it to people at home. For the first 3 years, those can only be owned by people from impacted communities. And so the existing retail stores didn't want to compete with that. And so they sued. They said it was a discriminatory policy, as in discriminatory against white people. And before it even got to court, there was such a massive backlash against that coalition for bringing that lawsuit that they dropped it before it was even heard. And sometimes that's what you have to do because that's the power that you have and you have to use it.
As you were saying that, I think one of the big thinking about how we bring people inside is the stigma, and having, I suppose, safe spaces or conversations like this where people can come in and share information, but also exchange knowledge about, I think it's when I speak to people, they're really concerned about the harms of cannabis still. So there is this whole sway of people who believe it's bad, think there's loads of harms. How do we kind of combat that argument, especially here where we have a medical institution, an establishment which understands the benefits of cannabis, but isn't outspoken enough to say, let's, you know, to challenge the government. So yeah, it's a bit of a backwards question, but I think that there needs to be something about addressing the stigma. And the reason I speak about this is because Black people already are disproportionately impacted by policing. So if you go to these sorts of events and start saying I smoke weed, they're going to start stopping you when you leave the event. You know, it is really true. These are things that go through people's minds. Yeah. If you're at work and you've attended a cannabis event and you're there, will your boss want to start, you know, urine testing you? It's not paranoia. It's just thinking, if you put your head about the parapet, how can you ensure you're safe? So I think it's really important that we have events like this where people can come and hear the information from advocates such as yourself and have it. But I think we really are not to be cautious, but have to understand that with this 3% of the population, people are scared about being noticed for the wrong reasons, and how we can support them in this journey so that they stay at the center of the conversation. You're just nodding here, Viv.
I'm really enjoying the conversation, and I think, you know, sometimes the main thing that's really playing back in my head over and over again is the importance of us being unapologetic as we move forwards. We're 100% signed up to driving the agenda going forwards, and that's very clear. I think one of the viewers made the point about not another commission, and I understand the cynicism. There's definitely a climate in the community. People are tired of waiting, tired of listening. They know that government often uses these, you know, these committees and these review processes in order to kick the ball off into the long grass, and it gives them time to effectively, you know, bypass us and once again sideline us. So there's a lot of frustration and skepticism and cynicism that we're going to need to deal with as a partnership going forwards, that we have to keep in the forefront of our minds. And that's where I think the relationship with our partners and our allies who are, you know, it's like time travel, isn't it? Having these kinds of conversations. We're talking to people that are ahead of us, and what we can do, just as Charlene has said, is we take the learning and build on that. And I'm really thinking hard, because come Monday, we'll be sitting down with Transform to say, okay, what was the learning from that conversation? How do we build this forward? And one of the things that's in the forefront of my mind now that I wasn't even thinking about, even though it now is really obvious, is how do we factor, the processes and the resources necessary to make sure our relationships with pre-existing organizations in the UK, in America and elsewhere, make sure that those relationships are as tight and as seamless as possible. How do we use the technology? How do we use the greater emphasis on, online and digital communication to make that happen in a way that's going to bring us the results that we're looking for, given what Charlene stated, which is that, we're outgunned, out-resourced, out-lawyered, and so on and so forth. We're going to need to be very smart about it from the outset.
Yeah, as Charlene was speaking, I think that especially for younger people, and I say younger being like the under 30s, is having the example that's been set in America and having access to people who are leading will make it seem like it's so much doable. So we saw it with the Black Lives Matter stuff and how that just developed over here. And I'm really hoping that the same will happen around this drug space, that we can really learn from like people like Cassandra and yourselves and invoke and stimulate a discussion that hasn't been had. As I think it was Jane who said, this is a really poignant year. It's the 50th anniversary of the Misuse of Drugs Act. It's the 35th anniversary of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. It's the coming together of so many things. I think we're in a really beautiful position to ally, but also to learn from one another. So I'm really excited to hear for the rest of the evening about the entrepreneurship, because we've touched on the policy work, and taken from this, we do need to have regulation. There's going to have to be some regulation, and it's better that we start having those conversations now and be part of the table, as opposed to trying to catch the horse from the stable, which can be very frustrating and difficult, least of all working in a political system. So really keen to learn those lessons from our partners in the US. And it's been fantastic, because I've just noticed all the people speaking so far have been women and sisters. So there's no gender divide here, but considering like we're often left out in this argument or like sidelined, it's just such an honor and a pleasure to have started the evening on with such strong speakers.
Yeah, no, I did that.
Okay, we move swiftly on because we saw that. He uses always mansplaining, taking over. Thank you, of course.
Charlene, thank you once again. We've got very fond memories of you lighting up Hackney 2 years ago.
Me too.
So looking forward to definitely being in the same physical space as soon as possible. But we're going to move swiftly on. We're already running behind time. This is how dynamic and complex an issue this is. So thank you everyone from the first panel.
Thank you, ladies.
We're going to politely nudge you off, and we're going to bring on the next panel neatly, swiftly. We're going to have a challenge because we've got some real big talkers on here. We've got Lee Jasper, we know how he likes to talk. But the first person we're going to have on is the CEO of Transform, James Nichols, to talk a little bit more about the alliance and some of the corporate related sides of the commercial environment. So welcome, James.
Hello, James. Muted.
Am I still muted? Am I unmuted? I'm glad I was the first mute error. Hi everyone, so can you hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, well thanks. I'm going to keep my talk fairly short, not just because we're running over time, but because there are people coming after who've got a lot more to say on the issue of entrepreneurship and the business side of this. It's been absolutely brilliant so far to hear from everybody else. It's just fantastic, and it's been a great launch so far. And thank you to Katrina as well for coming in to co-host. It's been great. So, I think James already set out a lot what Transform's interests here are. Having advocated for drug policy reform for over 20 years, when we saw the kind of changes that were happening in North America and in the US and Canada and in other countries over the last few years, on one level it was, oh my God, this is amazing. We've crossed that line. We've started to see legal regulation happen, and that was very exciting. But I think what happened very quickly, and I don't think this was just for Transform, I think it's for a lot of people in the drug policy reform community, was it very quickly became obvious that the story did not finish with legal regulation. That legal regulation was not the end point, because it became quite clear quite quickly that it wasn't just a matter of why we needed to end the war on drugs, clear as those arguments are, or that we needed to end it, but it was a question of how we end it properly, and how we end it justly, and how we end it equitably. And that was not immediately obvious, because the way that regulation happened in a number of places didn't immediately produce those outcomes, as everyone has said. And so the question then has become, as everyone has been pointing out, that to end the war on drugs properly, or to regulate properly, absolutely means that you don't just exchange the racism and inequalities of prohibition for a market structure that just sustains yet more racial and social inequality. Or you don't want to just close the door on one system which marginalizes and excludes, and open it to another that achieves similar outcomes. And that is a real risk, and that is something that we know can be the outcome. And what is the benefit there? You know, we need, that's the question we need to ask. So I think two things for us come from that. One is the realization that we were actually at the start of a journey, not at the end, or we were maybe at the end of the beginning, or however that works out, and that we're starting to learn how to try and do this properly, and what the bigger implications of it are. I think that whole point about recognizing that drug policy reform does not sit in a silo in isolation from wider structural and systemic inequalities, and the systems which enforce racism and social inequality. Where does drug reform sit in that? That's part of our learning. And also, to the point that's been made a number of times already, is while doing that, also recognizing that although drug prohibition enables and exacerbates the instruments of systemic racism, legal regulation doesn't undo those structures and those systems. So getting that understanding right about what the relationship between those things are is, again, a learning journey that we're on, and that we're really hoping this partnership helps us to understand better. So
definitely, James.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's it's that sense now, I think, for us of being at the start of something. Well, I think at one point, maybe people thought they were much near the end of something, and we're not. So, and I think getting legal regulation right, that does mean reflecting the needs and the experiences and the aspirations of the communities who've been hardest hit by the war on drugs. It means ensuring that, as far as possible, the previous injustices caused by law enforcement are addressed, so expungement of previous convictions being absolutely vital, and also ensuring, this goes to, I think, Neve's point about decriminalisation, ensuring that in policing a regulated system, or implementing a regulated system, you don't then just shift that harsh disproportionate policing onto people who are still operating outside of that system, because again, then what you're doing is continuing the problems that we saw before. On the kind of how do you deal with this from a kind of business regulation side? I mean, Shailene is much better placed on this than me, but prior to coming into drug policy, I've spent many years working in alcohol policy, and from that perspective, I saw from firsthand just how powerful and influential big corporates can be, and the extent to which all the stuff that Shailene's been talking about, that they can use their economic muscle to lobby governments effectively. They can hire the best lawyers, they can buy the biggest properties, they can set up the biggest production and logistics operations, they can spin the best stories, they can manipulate the evidence more effectively, they can create the biggest marketing operations. And so it's from the get-go, getting into that battle, which regulation means, with established multinational, usually very white corporates, is an unequal battle. So how do we, and this is what's so exciting about what we're trying to achieve here, is how do we try and, as people have said, get ahead of that curve and try and set that groundwork? Because although there's that crucial point that we're talking about bigger systemic issues. We're talking about capitalism more generally. We're talking about those market structures. Even within the kind of existing structures that we do have, provisionally, as it were, governments do have tools in the box to create systems that can promote a more level playing field, that can support entry to market among previously marginalised and poorer communities, and that can, as Shailene was saying, even through things like limitations on the number of outlets you can run, the size of the businesses you can own, that can put constraints on the power of big business, to steamroll its way to the kind of market dominance, which will produce the outcomes that we know we're not looking for. So I think that's why looking at this from this business perspective is really important, because the goal of promoting social equity and racial justice does, to some extent, it's about many things, but in some degree it is about, I think, establishing the right rules of business, creating the right regulations, creating the right licensing systems. I mean, the thing is, so much of this, when it's implemented, is about really tiny details. What are the licensing thresholds? How much do licenses cost? How do you set up issues around how many outlets are allowed in particular areas? They're quite boring, detailed things, but they can have really significant impacts down the line in terms of the outcomes for people trying to get into the market. So we need to engage with that rather kind of complex and slightly kind of technical discussion, but it's an important one for us to achieve. So all of those questions are there for us to begin to kind of address through this partnership. How do we make sure the right people are there from the start, shaping the system from the ground up, making the regulations, setting the framing and the understanding of what we're trying to achieve, helping us to achieve it. And as I say, from Transform's perspective, it's the beginning of something. It's a learning process. It's a process of collaboration and engagement and allyship. And that's exactly what we're hoping to get from this project. We've already got a lot from it already just this evening. So I'm hugely excited to see where it takes us. And I'm just really looking forward to seeing where it goes.
Beautiful. Steve was just talking about encapsulating a lot of what you were just saying, James, in avoiding corporate capture. And we know they're at an advanced stage. You know, they're much like ourselves. They're future mapping and preparing for you know, the opportunities that they believe will come their way. So yeah, as has already been stated by our colleagues in the States, it's good that we're getting out the gate with our alliance now and beginning to prepare the ground going forwards. Well, let me just get I hope he's pronouncing your name right. So Sean Adedeji, CEO of Elevate Cannabis, on and out right now to hear a bit more about the commercial side of things, if he's already available. I'm not sure that he is. Maybe not. Then Amber. Let's have Amber up, because Amber's like me. She's a hybrid. I haven't had a chance to meet you yet, Amber, but I have heard great things. I've heard that you're a hybrid. You'll do the policy and the commercial.
Yeah,
it's the way we have to move. Be flexible and dynamic. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself, actually, and incorporate and elevate a pitch if you wish.
Yeah.
We're here, mouth shut, ears open.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Amber Center. I'm a CEO of Breeze Distro. We're a manufacturer and distributor headquartered here in Oakland, California. Also an advocate. I'm an executive director and co-founder of Supernova Women. And we're a group of Black and Brown women that works to create opportunities for Black and Brown people in cannabis. So we worked with the city of Oakland to develop the first social equity program in the country. We worked with the city of San Francisco to develop the second social equity program in the country. Wow. And then we worked with the state of California to create essentially a fund that now funds all the local social equity programs throughout the state of California. So not only am I an advocate in this space, but I also run and pilot a few of these equity programs that have also been created. I have something called Equity Works Incubator. It's an incubator that we have 6 social equity operators that come into our space. We teach them how to create infused cannabis products that are ready for the retail market. Yep. And then we distribute them throughout to different retailers throughout the state. And then most recently, Supernova Women launched a workforce development program that actually recruits social equity workers, and we train them at my incubator. So we're really working on like a number of different, just testing out and piloting a number of different programs and just trying to create structures that support Black and Brown entrepreneurs in cannabis.
Amazing. And you know, I'm sitting here. I say to people, I'm one of those individuals. I like to think about the actual process of making mad money, but then, you know, in living simply. And I think the living simply bit is the policy part, and the making mad money part is to do with, you know, the poverty that so many of us come out of. And even if we don't personally come out of poverty, the community that we come out of is so often impoverished, whether it be in the lack of access to information and allyship, partnership, and opportunities. So what you're talking about there, and especially as a Black woman, is really inspirational. And I know that many of the sisters over here in the UK and the young talent coming up will be really motivated, inspired to hear what you've got to say. I think it's also really important to get this point out, which is that we've got a number of events that we're planning over the next year to 2 years. And we want to do that in, you know, close consultation and partnership with yourself and organizations like yours. And we know that there are many more springing up in America as things really get moving. That's so important because, you know, we do have to think about it, as has already been said, in a global context, as even at the same time that we're acting locally. So I'm really excited about what you said. Can you say a little bit more about the incubator processes, just a little bit, before I get the next speaker out?
Yeah, absolutely. So the incubator, you know, we saw this was necessary because it's addressing a number of different things: access to real estate, access to technical assistance. It's really hard navigating the compliance and just cannabis as it is. You know, it's been regulated like it's plutonium. So it's crazy. You know, folks think that, you know, it's really easy to make a pre-roll, but the pre-roll has to be made with such precision, and there's a process around it, and people have to be taught all these things. Even just yesterday, we had an inspection at our shared, at the incubator, and the state came in, and the level of inspection was just so incredibly intense. But I'm really glad that my team was there to help support all of the incubatees and make sure that we had a successful inspection. If they were left by themselves, I just don't think it would have went very well. But that is what's needed here in the community, is that we bring in this support that actually cares and wants to make sure that our community succeeds. And I think that, you know, there's been a lot of talk around social equity programs and how they're failing, but really, I think when the advocates and someone with some business acumen that actually comes from the community and cares gets involved, you'll see a difference in these programs. And also, we have to have a level of accountability to these the states and the cities and the jurisdictions that are implementing these programs. You can't let them just put these things out and check a box. Like, we have to make sure that we're holding these places accountable and that we're pushing them to the limits. So, you know, I'm really excited to be in this position to help my community succeed. You know, I have personal buy-in here. I want to make sure they succeed, and I think that that is really a critical role in making sure that the community is involved, because the community cares.
Beautiful.
As Amber was saying that, something came to mind. It's also what Jane said, is that next year we have like local elections, and then those people come into term for a certain period. They're meant to have local representation. How do we connect in with local representatives and bring this to them? Because Amber was saying that you had the initiatives with different areas and that you were able to advise and inform. And I think if we get them in for a 4-year term next year, is there scope in building some longevity in that?
I think that's a
that
great
engagement?
question that we should put to Lord Simon Woolley.
Ooh.
So thank you, Amber. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber.
The beginning of a beautiful relationship, I'm sure. Let's see if we can get Simon Woolley in to pick up on some of these more political, processy, UK specific questions.
Hey.
There he is.
Nice to be with you.
It's important that we had to do a lot of cajoling because Simon's such a valuable resource in the UK. We had to do a lot of cajoling to get him in here for this event, and it was critical to have him on board because he played such an instrumental part in getting us to this point, and he's been heavily coaching me over the last 4 years. It's probably the polite way of putting it, to make sure that the amplification that we've been talking about this evening is realized. And he's been out there sometimes very much like a lone soldier beating the drum in the front line. So I think it's just great to acknowledge the sacrifice that Simon has contributed over the years, and also now to hear what he has to say about how we move things forward.
Thank you.
Lord Simon Wood.
Thank you, Viv. And of course, can we just say Simon, please? Listen, it's great to be with you all. I want to give a shout out to Amber over in Oakland, California. How are you, sister? You know, we were there in the 90s with Elihu Harris, and he was a former mayor there, and we did great work. We brought him over to London, and he helped us galvanize the black vote. What Elihu Harris helped us do was to ensure that you got a political and economic voice to move the dial on race equality. And it's also good. It's also good to be with Katrina. I mean, Katrina's been really at the sharp end of drugs policy, and particularly how it's affected Black youths. And so it's great to see her center stage, and you, Viv, you've got the scars to show it too. So many of us come back from a long journey of seeing when we read the book, the war on drugs, Jim Crow, the new war on drugs from Michelle. Gosh, I've forgotten her surname. But we knew that was part of our story too in the UK.
Oh.
The demonization, the criminalization, the oppression of the state, and using their sharpest tool, which has always been punitive drugs policy. And I think that our North American brothers and sisters were surprised that we were incarcerating more Black people through drugs policy than you were in the States. This was their deepest tool, deepest, sharpest tool that they have been using against us. And so we've been campaigning. We've been using the skills from the USA to make the arguments about effective policing, about punitive drugs policy actually serves no purpose in tackling the drugs policy, but also demonizes a generation of those that ought to be on the side of law enforcement and not running away from them. You know, I was in a meeting the other day in a part of London. I'm not going to say because it's a little bit insensitive at the moment. That a senior police officer said that we use stop and search. Amber, you call it stop and frisk. And he said that there's a link between drugs and violent gangs, and that's why we disproportionately stop Black people. And then when I quizzed him a little bit more, and I said, well, what is the rates of arrest and convictions to white people? And he said 24%. I said, what is the arrest and conviction of Black people? He said 24%. And I said, but how many more times do you stop Black people? He said 7 times.
Oh.
And then I just left it there for him to ponder. And he said, yeah, I know something's going wrong. And what we've got to hone in on, what is going wrong is a political racial mindset that demonizes whole communities. I'm sure Katrina's spoken about this, and I think it was April or May last year, when 95% of our country, Amber, was in lockdown. Everybody was hiding behind closed doors because of COVID-19, told to stay behind doors. But at the very same time, stop and search for Black people went up 25%. 40,000 Black people were stopped and searched in 1 month alone, which basically meant cop cars going around looking for Black people. I smell drugs, stop, search, you humiliate. So, we're talking about how we might be, Amber, in the USA, but we're not even at go here. But what activists like Katrina and I heard some of the other panelists before, and I'm really been encouraged that collectively we've got the city mayor, who is a big fish in the political pool, to do one thing: to have an adult conversation about drugs policy. That's the starting point. And so we're not saying for him to go one side or the other, just to lay bare the facts. That you want to do effective policing. You want to look at this through a public health lens to help the most vulnerable. So let's lay all the facts bare and see where we go. Because James knows, Amber knows, Katrina and Viv know that when you lay that bare, you say to yourself, the present modus operandi is not solving the problems of people taking drugs or the criminality around drugs. Actually, it's making it worse.
Oh.
And then we lead to what James and Neve have talked about at release, as the baby steps to decriminalizing. Yes, Amber, we want to go on that path. But even, let's say we fast forward to 3 to 5 years, then you're presented with another set of problems. That cannabis is decriminalized and is open for sale, but you're still within a racialized business structure. So you're no longer criminalizing Black people, but that racialized economic structure still locks Black people out. And we've seen it in some parts of the States that when there's a buck to be shown, those that were demonizing Black people are now center stage of the business entity, and Black people are still on the margins. This is what I like about the work with Viv, because what Viv and Lee Jasper is going to speak next have sought to do is to say this cannot be dealt with in a narrow prism of drugs policy. This has to be seen in a wider context. Drugs is the sharp end of racism. And if you deal with the systemic racism, the systemic race inequality in education, in health, in business, that when you open up to regulation and decriminalization, then we have the opportunities to be the business men and women that we want to be. But it cannot be done. It cannot be done in this narrow prism of let's decriminalize and everything will be okay. Because the oppression of Black people will pivot from drugs to something else or other drugs.
Oh.
Here's the thing, and I'll close here, Viv, because you've got others to speak on this. After this dreadful year of COVID-19 and the emergence of the 21st century civil rights activist through Black Lives Matter, we have the opportunity of the greatest conversation about structural racism ever in our history. And it's for us activists, business men and women, and political leaders to seize it. Because if we're honest, and we don't want to, some Amber, people keep saying we need to build back better. We don't want to go to back, because back wasn't great. We want to build new, better. Open up the opportunities in education, in business. This is our time. Let me say this, James knows this. Our government are in denial. They've got their head in the sand. They're denying structural racism. But, you know, there's another world out there. There's another world in business. There's another world in community. And there's another world with academia who are hurtling forward from a progressive narrative. We have got to join forces across the Atlantic to find the narrative that unleashes talent, that unleashes a progressive politics that deals with the punitive drugs policy and unleashes education and business. Amber and James, Katrina, this is our time. This is our time that our leadership has to come out of the shadows, own this narrative, take our mayor on a journey, and you will see great things can happen. Thank you, Viv.
Perfect, sir. Perfect.
Fantastic.
Lovely. Landed it beautifully. Okay. And I think this is the right time to bring in Mr. Lee Jasper to uncharacteristically for him, tidy up some really amazing contributions. And Simon Willies very eloquently and dynamically summed up the challenge for us over the next 2 years. So Lee, co-founder of Black Sox, it's for you to bring it into the harbour in 4 minutes, sir, or less.
Sorry,
Okay,
sorry,
well-
Lee. Sorry, Lee. I'm sorry, man. I didn't know there was 4 minutes. I thought we had another half an hour.
It's karma. I've done this to people all my life. So,
There you go.
look, I just want to say what a fantastic debate it is in relation to tonight's event, and the amount of learning that we're taking out of tonight. Trust me, we could sell it for gold. It's immeasurable in terms of the information and the guidance that we're getting, particularly from our African American communities and what they've done so far. Black Sox has been working on this issue for a number of years, and just want to say big thanks really to Open Society, who initially funded our work in relation to this area. We produced a report called Structural Racism as UK Drugs Policy, published in November '96, written by myself, Annette Dale Pereira, the member of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, and Viv Amoon, were the 3 authors of that report. And it very much echoed what we're hearing today, that when we consulted Black youth up and down the country about drugs policy and the drugs policy debate, people were saying legislation won't cure institutionalized racism. Is one of the major findings of the report back in 2016. So we're hearing that echoed again now today very strongly. And look, I think the part of the drugs debate fits into the debate about reparations and social justice. We know that Bristol City Council have taken forward the idea of looking at reparations for the African and Caribbean heritage communities here in the United Kingdom, and this could be part of a overall package of social justice and equity that is part of a reparations movement, and certainly part of a reconfiguring and paradigm shift brought about by the global Black Lives Matter movement that has demanded such radical change on the issues of race equality. Look, here in the United Kingdom and in London in particular, we've got what we might call one of the most right-wing newspapers in the capital, the London Evening Standard, running a front page saying, is it time to legalise cannabis? And when you begin to look into the background of the debate, 63% of Londoners want to see cannabis regulated. No wonder that the Mayor of London is taking it seriously as he goes forward to election, because you can see quite clearly the majority of Londoners have viewed and made their views quite well known. Now, the Mayor's action plan and the intended drugs commission that he intends to produce, let's be clear, he doesn't have the power to legalise cannabis. All he could do is make be an advocate and produce a policy, a very powerful voice, nevertheless, but it's up to government initially And of course, we've already seen government slap down any idea of cannabis legalization in the UK. But that's because I think the black community is not at the drugs policy table. And we're not mobilizing communities in a kind of creative way within the context of reparations that sees this as part of that social equity and justice agenda going forward. I think it's very, very important. And let me just say that allyship and anti-racism of white organizations is important. And what Black Talks has sought to do here is to set a new standard in what that allyship is, where we lead unapologetically black-led on the issues that affect us. Nothing about us without us is the disability movement's call. And we echoed that strongly here in the United Kingdom. But all is not lost, because there is a conservative drug policy research group, if you can believe it, made up of Tory politicians, and they're advocating similarly. Now, I know that they're doing that because there's a big international tobacco, big capital lobby that is pushing hard around medicinal cannabis, cannabis oil and cannabis legislation here in the United Kingdom. And it's that big capital and that big money that is turning sections of the Conservative Party through this drug policy research group to look again at this issue. And let's be clear about the amount of money we're talking about. It's estimated that 250 tons of cannabis were sold in Britain. That's on Cold Harbour Lane, Brixton alone, and that at a cost of 2.6 billion to over 3 million consumers. Those are woeful underestimates, but they are the Institute of Economic Affairs. That report's just published today. You can find it online, and it just talks about possibly generating a windfall tax contribution to the Treasury of over £1 billion. Now, with the economy in tatters post-pandemic and the effects of Brexit, I'm sure this is going to become increasingly likely to be considered a good business case in Tory circles as time goes on. So we're perfectly ready, and we need to be ready in order to get ourselves into position to put leverage on big capital and big tobacco now, not wait until these licenses are given, but to get into relationships with them now and hold them to account. Some of them with deep colonial roots. I mean, let's be clear. Some of them with deep colonial roots, having former sugar plantations and now went on to tobacco plantations. We can hold these people to account by moral authority in terms of their historic oppression of our communities. And just for people who are interested, look, there's a group called First Wednesdays. And First Wednesdays is a network of entrepreneurs, investors, and investors in the European cannabis sector. And it started off with 13 members. It's now got over 500 members in its London chapter. And the reason why that is grown is because Britain is the biggest supplier of medicinal, or one of the biggest suppliers of medicinal cannabis in the world. And there is huge opportunities for moving into medicinal cannabis sector now. Now, there are some problems in terms of the Byzantine type of regulation.
Dean, let me bring you in, sir. I've given you an extra 3 minutes. If you could just wind up so that we can close schedules wise. Thank you, sir.
There is this Byzantine regulation about medical cannabis and its production. But again, there are different rules that apply in the British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, Guernsey, and the Isle of Man. So having a strategy that looks at British overseas territories and the production of cannabis for our people, for our community, can offer opportunities. And of course, there is Europe. And Europe's taking a completely different view to the UK on these matters. So opening an office in Ireland, for instance, gives you access to 750 million people in Europe. So look, the opportunities are there. I wouldn't underestimate the difficulty. And I think where we are in terms of this alliance, looking about policy, looking at social equity, looking at reparations and social justice post Black Lives Matter, I think we're in a good position to be able to put the squeeze on some of these big capital industries, big tobacco industries, and start to shake them up now about what we see as ethical partnerships with Black communities to address some of these issues.
Beautiful. Thank you, Lee. Only 4 minutes over. There's some very important points that you've made, and I think, and are really important to make that point for our brothers and sisters in the States, so that they're in no doubt as to our commitment and our willingness to thuggerize the institution in order to get the outcomes that we're looking for our communities. So time is tight, and there are other schedules on this platform. So I'm going to end by saying 100% respect, thank you, praise, and excitement for the road ahead in allyship with Transform, who have gone out of their way to give us access to their resources and their connections, because we know it's all about the networks. I'd say to people on many occasions, don't give me the money, give me access to the networks, the intelligence, the resources, and we'll do the rest. So we're excited about the alliances transatlantically and elsewhere on the planet, and deepening the relationships that we've had intermittently in the past with organizations like Release and the new organizations on the block as well. Katrina is a dynamic, forthright individual, and she's been quite passive this evening in the host role, but we know when she's on fire up there as the expert on the panel, there's no holding her back. So thank you, everyone, all the panelists and those who've sat in on this broadcast today in our modest launch. There's much, much, much more to come. Have a pleasant evening and an outstanding weekend, and let's hope that we get some sun on this side of the Atlantic over the next few days. Thank you very much. My name is Viv Amun, part of Black Sox, part of the Transform and Black Sox Alliance. Thank you.